Last year I made myself this coat, based on a commercially available pattern but inspired by early 19th century men's overcoats. However, I really felt like it wasn't finished. I massively prefer a lined coat to an unlined one. So let's revisit this project together and, through some elaborate archaeology, I can show you how I went about creating this coat in the first place. And we can maybe give it a bit of a special upgrade I've been thinking about. The pattern is McCalls M4745, yes, the American Civil War uniform pattern, with some fairly hefty modifications I'll get into in detail a bit later. I've used and abused this pattern a bunch of times, and I've kept all my modified patterns together, so figuring out which pattern pieces I want to use each time is a whole step in and of itself. I've got this rose-coloured silk for the lining. I'm not usually a 100% silk lining kind of guy, or rather I aspire to be that person, but my wallet says no. However, I bought this very cheaply from another costumer because it was damaged. You'll see when I'm ironing it, always iron your fabric before cutting out, especially if it's a lightweight fabric like this. It can make a really big difference in how accurate your pieces are. The big creases from being folded come out, but the very fine little crinkles don't. I think they're in there for good, and there's not really anything I can do about it at this point. That's fine for a lining though, so I don't mind. Once the fabric is ironed, I refold it in preparation for cutting. Having the fabric folded in half lengthways is necessary for a lot of cutting layouts, but additionally, when dealing with a piece of fabric this big, where it's not going to all fit on my cutting table at once, I think it's 8 or 9 meters in total, I like to stack the fabric in accordion folds so that I can pull more off the top as I go. There's actually not much to this pattern after modifications. 2 back pieces, 2 front pieces. Yes, these look kind of funky, I'll get into the details a little later on. The body of the coat was the main section I needed to alter for both size and style. I kept the pattern's original 2-part sleeves, but I did draft a new skirt. The original was fine, I just wanted a different style. A longer and more conical half circle shape, which is actually cut as 4 identical 1/8 circles. The silk fabric isn't quite wide enough to cut these on the fold, so I left the skirts until last and refolded the fabric widthways to accommodate them. The construction of the coat and the lining are basically the same and not very complicated. Sew together, clip the seams and press well. Two-part sleeves can be a bit of a nightmare for this, and there's a variety of things you can buy to make your sleeve pressing life easier, but honestly I've never found anything cheaper or that works better than tightly rolling an old towel into a sausage and stuffing it inside your sleeve. Just mind those fingers. I'm lining this the old-fashioned way, which is more time-consuming but in many ways simpler. Once I've made up the lining, it's just a case of putting it inside the coat, wrong sides together, turning the seam allowances under and hand-stitching it down. The coat fabric is this very thick boiled wool, so it's not even like the stitches might show through to the other side. If I was just lining this coat, then I'd be done by now, but I have a bit of a surprise up my sleeve, so let's get on with looking at the pattern and how I've altered it. The skirt is just a very simple half circle drafted from scratch to the length I want and the waist measurements of the finished coat. The body is the interesting bit and it's gone through a couple of iterations. For starters, the smallest size of this pattern is a 34 to 36 inch chest, which is already big on me before you even start factoring in the embarrassingly large amount of ease big pattern companies add in. And if you've only ever sewn with women's patterns, guess what? The men's ones are even worse in this respect. So as a basic pattern, I've got new front and back pieces where I've removed something like 4 inches in total from the circumference, plus that is extended into the shoulder so they're an inch smaller across the top. For this pattern, however, I looked at some references and it seems like for overcoats in the Regency and Romantic eras, it was fairly common for them to not have side seams. So I went ahead and joined the front and side back pieces together into one. Since I'm going to be doing a bit of pattern drafting on the big paper anyway, provided my supervisor here signs off on the quality of my work, I can show you how I usually do the adjustment to join 2 pattern pieces from a commercial pattern together. It's definitely not the conventional way of doing it, but I am all about those shortcuts. The first thing you do is trace off the first pattern piece, and you can ignore the fact that I'm using a piece I've already drafted. It's the same as a tissue pattern piece in the important factor that it still has the commercial standard seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters included. Along the seam where I want to join the 2 pieces, I'm using my transparent quilting ruler, one of the best sewing purchases I've ever made. I use this nearly every day, and I'm drawing a line 5/8 of an inch in from the edge of the pattern piece. That's where the sewing line would be. Then I'm adding a second guideline 5/8 of an inch further in from that, so that I can line up the edge of the second pattern piece with this guideline and trace off the rest of the new pattern from there. I find this a lot quicker and easier than tracing both pieces separately and then trying to tape them together. This is the method I use to combine the front and back side pieces of this coat into one, but here I'm actually joining the front and back at the shoulder to create a collar facing piece. Why do I need this? Well, if you've been around YouTube for a while, you may be familiar with the cut of women's clothing, probably one of the more frustrating historical costuming resources out there. It's less likely that you'll have encountered its less prestigious but equally frustrating and still not reprinted counterpart, the cut of men's clothing. This book somehow manages to be slightly worse than the cut of women's clothing in every possible way, and yet also the only even vaguely comprehensive resource on historical menswear out there. Emphasis on the vague. Which led me to the section where all of the 19th century is squished into one chapter, there's no comprehensive overview for any given decade, and not all of the plates are dated. But there is this reproduced plate from the Tailor's Friendly Instructor, 1822, thank you Google Books. What did we do before the internet? Which has no instructions or further information, but shows what I believe to be the drafting layout for an overcoat with capes. And I thought, well, capes? So something I'd seen a lot of other YouTubers do is that when they're undecided about something, they ask their Instagram followers to weigh in. And this seems to work really well for some people. And I can only conclude that I am way too opinionated for this to ever work for me. So I asked Instagram whether or not I should do capes on the coat. I have many answers in, and my conclusion is that you're all wrong. Now, admittedly, some of you are wrong in that way that when you ask a question because you just want to see if you're disappointed by the answer. A bunch of people said, no, don't add capes. And I was like, I'm gonna add capes though. That's definitely happening now. Absolutely no way I'm leaving this alone. But then a whole, like, more than half of the people said, make capes that you can button on and off. And I literally, this is no shade to any of you, I cannot imagine anything worse. I've had collars like that, they're awful. I didn't realize people liked that. It's always a terrible idea, especially with how heavy that fabric is and the fact that it's going to be probably 3 or 4. Most overcoats seem to have 3 or 4. So we're not doing that. There's no buttons on this coat, there's no buttons. I don't want to add buttons just around the hide them under the collar. It doesn't have one. It doesn't have one, so I'd have to give it a collar in the first place, which is not set up to do. It's cut back, there's no seam allowance. It's net around the neck. So that's just not happening. I love you all dearly. Thank you so much for giving me your opinions. I respect them, but respectfully, you are incorrect. To be honest, I think what swayed me in the end was several people were like, don't put capes on it because they liked the line of the shoulder or they liked the waistline. I realize it looks like it has a nipped waist, and it does have those little puffy top sleeves. The thing is, it's a men's coat. The waistline is on my hip bones. It's really dropped because it's not meant to be, that's not super period accurate, but it fit better with a longer waist, a sort of more masculine cut there. It's not a historical recreation, it's ultimately being viewed by a modern audience trying to imagine themselves in a pseudo-historical time period. You gotta make some concessions to the way people's brains work as modern humans when you're trying to make something that reads right. But yeah, it's not supposed to have a nipped in waist. I don't want it to have little puffy sleeves. There's just nothing I could do about that without messing around with the pattern and potentially like my arm movement. So I have absolutely no problems covering those up and making it look more bulky and large, like it's supposed to be bulky and large. It's a men's overcoat. This is all an incredibly complicated and long-winded way of saying capes. We're doing capes. Capes are happening. Apologies to everyone who said no capes or removable capes, but I have decided, it is decreed, I am the only god here. Capes are happening. And thus I used the collar facing I just drafted and extended it into a not quite a full circle cape, using the body pieces to judge how long I wanted the longest to be. The plate in the book showed that in the draft, the capes came up higher in the front neck and were angled outwards, inwards. They extend past the front of the coat at the bottom front corner, probably to make them flare nicer over the chest. Instead of trying to draft that in, I just cut and retaped the front 2 inches of the pattern higher and at an angle, and then smoothed in the curves. Pattern drafting is not as complicated as people think it is. My sole concession to all the people who wanted removable capes is that I am mounting them onto a separate facing. I have added a very simple collar and am now lining up the centre back seams of the longest cape with the centre back of the facing. Because this fabric is so thick, I decided I would sew each cape in place at a slightly different margin and then trim back the seam allowance so that I could stagger the seams and not have to sew through 5 layers of boiled wool to attach the final one. In theory, this was a good idea, and I thought long and hard about how I would do it and in which order, but somehow managed to forget all of that in the moment, including the fact that the front edges are also staggered. The end result looks very messy at the front corners, so I think I need something to cover those up and make it look nice and neat. Currently, I have the cape facing pinned onto the coat as I want to wear it at least once without the capes. The final event of the system I made this for is coming up, and I don't think the capes work as well for that character. I've got a whole video talking about that costume if you'd like to see more and see the coat in its original unlined state. However, ultimately I think I will sew the facing in place. I'll technically be able to remove it if I ever decide I don't want to wear the capes again, but the overall look of the coat is, I think, much improved by the capes, and I don't want to be fussing around with safety pins through boiled wool all the time. Not to mention if the safety pins get wet. It's definitely a coat for wearing in bad weather, and I'm happy to commit to that given I live in the north of England. I hope you've enjoyed this video and are inspired to try some irresponsible pattern hacking on the basis of one image from a period drafting manual with no further information. It's really not all that difficult, and it usually works. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you'd like to see more Regency and romantic-inspired menswear in the coming months, and down in the description box you'll find a link to my Ko-fi page where you can make a one-off or recurring donation to support this channel and my aspirations to one day be a silk lining kind of guy. Ko-fi supporters get early access to all of my videos, the occasional extra sneak peek, and I couldn't do what I do without their help. Dream big, and I'll see you next time.